Welcome to the Red Gauge Podcast. We are your hosts. I'm Kyle. This is Josh. Today we're joined by the venerated friend of the show, Antonio Squillante. I'm glad to have you back for part 2 because we did not do a good job managing the clock last time. That was on us. We apologize for that. We apologize to all of Dr. Squillante's students for keeping him late and getting him to class late. So we got to get into part 2 so we can finish our conversation. And I really appreciate you coming back so soon to get through everything.
We just have a lot to talk, it's a good thing.
It is a good thing. It's normally at least 15 minutes into an episode before I'm completely lost and just shaking my head. Like that normally makes it a little bit venerated.
I lost you on venerated?
Yeah.
It's like somebody who's like prestigious, has a large number of awards, well respected, that kind of thing.
Venerated.
Yeah, I mean, I felt given the incredible
venerated as hell right there
resume that we went over last time, it felt like an appropriate title for a man working in the space doing all these things.
That's probably the highest compliment I've ever received, so thank you.
yeah, that's good. I mean, this now I feel like I'm going to turn it around and turn it into a dig, but like I feel like the highest compliment I've ever gotten is when somebody told me like, "Hey, your kids are pretty cool," and I'm like, "Yeah, I'm doing it. I'm being a dad." Okay, cool. So let's get into it. So last time we talked a little bit about velocity-based training. You got a book coming out real soon. Is it June 1st?
Yeah, the book is going to be presented this week at a big European conference, and then it's going to be in the libraries, I think, sometimes around the end of June.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then what was the full title? Because I remember it was a little longer. I didn't write it down.
It's just velocity-based training, evidence-based practice.
Okay.
It's a manual for practitioners. It's a nice book, but it's not like I hope it's a nice book, but it's not your regular textbook in the sense that it has a introduction with all the theory and the background studies on velocity-based training, but at the end there's a lot of programming and testing, so it's more of an applied manual, if you will.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. That's good because my questions today are all applied questions. I'm sure we'll get into other stuff because we always manage to, but
it is good to know. We had talked about last week. At my school, we almost got into it. We applied for a grant, but we just weren't able to secure the grant. But I had told them, like, you're going to have to send me somewhere. Like, this is a different space. Like, obviously, we're trying to set the same goals, and a lot will look similar. But you can't just be like, hey, you are now a velocity-based training strength coach.
Yeah. Our whole background is percentages and auto-regulation.
Right.
And so, like when you start getting away from that, there's some definite fidelity to adhere to. Okay, sweet. So let's get into it. So I don't know if I always do a good job. We've been trying to do a better job of giving people background. So if they're just turning in and they don't know anything about it, and you watch the last episode and you're like, I think I'm hanging on, I'm going to do a second episode. I got a few, just a few questions. We didn't talk a bunch about the kinds of equipment that we can use. Like we did mention linear position transducers, right? That's kind of our gold standard right now.
Yep.
Back in the day, there was a beautiful tool called the vector scope. Have you gotten to use one of those or seen one of those in action at all?
I've seen them, but never got to use them.
Yeah, I've seen one in action, and it's funny because like I have no idea what they're doing when they're looking at it.
We were joking. We looked it up, and it was like, oh, this is super really easy to read. Just like 7 plots on a freaking scatter. Like, oh yeah, look, they're doing well.
Pretty intense. There's a few other types of equipment. Could you just like real quick give us kind of a heads up on, I know that the linear position transducers, the LPTs, are kind of the gold standard for what we're using nowadays, right? But could you give us a little primer on what the challenges are with the equipment that we use and why it's important to have good equipment?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would take it a step back and say that we need to be no one's fault in that. It's just the way the industry works and operates. But we need to be deliberate when we say that something is the gold standard, because it depends if the gold standard respect to what. Like if we're looking at research, there is a gold standard when it comes to like collecting data that are very accurate, very precise, with good tests, retest, readability, and all that good stuff. Then you really need to go with the gold standard. So equipment that has been validated, tested, someone has published with that before. And when you do that, the cost of that equipment is significantly higher than what we consider to be friendly or user friendly for the majority of us. But that is the actual gold standard. That's what you're going to be using in a laboratory setting to collect information. There are linear position transducers that are considered the gold standards, and I'm not going to name brands on this podcast, but if you look on PubMed or Google Scholar, you can find them. They're technically not the actual gold standard when it comes to velocity-based training. They're normally compared against something else like motion capture system, triaxial force plates, and whatnot. But they are very, very good enough that you can publish data with, and that's all that matters when it comes to research. They're very expensive. They work like any other linear position transducer on the surface. It's just the accuracy and precision of that data collection is much, much higher. But then you can look at the same technology, which is the linear position transducer. So there's a cable that connects to the barbell, and the displacement of that cable allows you to measure velocity. Then you can have the same device, which is no longer a gold standard because it's a bit more simple when it comes to the engineering of it and the manufacture. And you can purchase it for way cheaper. Like we're talking about $2,500 compared to $250.
Right.
So it's a pretty significant change in price. And I'm not saying that $250 is cheap because it's not cheap, but it's definitely more affordable than $2,500 for someone that wants to use it for training. And at that point, you have an excellent device, somewhere comparable with the gold standard when it comes to at least the precision of the measurements. It might not be just as accurate, but if you're not publishing data with that, in my opinion, you might as well just purchase one of those linear position transducer, because having the cable is always going to give you a significant advantage over any other type of device that can be similar price, but without the cable. So when it comes down to the user, just don't look at what we consider the gold standard because it's going to be way too expensive for what you need it. Just look at the similar technology, which is a cable device, and purchase one that is a little bit more affordable and just get a lot of practice with it. In my opinion, and I think at the lab now I have at least 7 or 8 different linear position transducer when it comes to brands. Some are American made, some are European, some are from Australia. I have one from Asia, and they're, to be honest, when you're not looking at publishing data, they're all pretty similar. They're all good.
Yeah.
Now, if you take that and you compare it to what you need to publish data, that's a pretty significant gap. Like you can measure that; it's quantifiable. But for day-to-day practice, like it doesn't make that much of a difference. We did test quite a good number of phone-based or camera-based systems to measure bar velocity, which are very appealing because all you need is a phone, and you don't need to mark the barbell. You don't need anything like that. Just in my personal experience, and I might be wrong, so I don't want anyone to quote me on that, but like I've yet to find one that is somewhere close or comparable with the cheapest linear position transducer on the market. So in my opinion, if you want to do velocity-based training, there is going to be a learning curve, and the learning curve is going to be pretty steep, and it's only going to get better if you start using VBT and start making sense of it with your day-to-day practice. You don't want to climb that curve with a device that gives you a lot of headaches because it's not reliable. So instead of going with the cheapest option that might just confuse you too much, and use like a camera-based or like phone-based device, just invest in a affordable linear position transducer, maybe a used one that there's a used market for those too, and at least start practicing with that and get experience, because that measuring velocity, as important as it is and as objective as it needs to be, is only the tip of the iceberg. It's what you do with that velocity that matters. So, and that's your knowledge. Like I always tell our students, we live and operate in a world that is technology based now when it comes to strength and conditioning. Like everything is technology. Force plates, program design, everything goes through a software. You don't go to school for 4+ years to rely on a software to do your job. We are the software. We run and operate information. We just need access to data that our eyes can capture. So that's all we need from a velocity-based training device. That's the extent of it. A good, reliable measurement of velocity. And of course, if we're only using for our day-to-day training, and if we're a gym enthusiast or power lifters or weightlifters or whatever the case may be, any cheap device will get the job done.
Yeah. Um, Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably worth mentioning if you're kind of new to the space and you're starting to think about like reading studies. I think it's a great thing to do. It provides a lot of context on how things work. And if you really get into it, like you pick a topic and you go all the way back and find studies from the 50s or 60s or whatever and read them. It's really interesting to see how something evolves over time and how it kind of finds its place.
Yep.
And one of the key features that we're looking for whenever we're doing research is we want to be able to test well, and to test well, stuff has to be valid and reliable, right?
Yep.
So if you have a measurement, like if you got a camera system and it gives you good measurements, it gives you bar speed, but it doesn't always know that it's supposed to be on or whatever, like if you have any kind of issues with recording, then that's a real issue. Like you want it to be something that produces something that's repeatable all the time.
Absolutely.
I know Dr. Hoff, when we had him on, he mentioned that some of the technology that people have used for velocity-based training has required like they'll pause at the bottom and pause at the top of a rep so that the device has a chance to kind of like reset to get more accurate measurements. But then you lose, your validity of like that's not really how we lift in the weight room, unless you're like a competitive power lifter, right? Like there's some issues there. So is that something that you would be concerned about at all, or is that
I respectfully disagree with that statement. I think if you think in terms of physiology, there's a lot of benefit in
right?
adding a pause between the eccentric and the concentric muscle action. And I just give you a very simple analogy. I'll try to keep it as simple as possible. I hope it gets the message across. Like, if you want to get better at something, like physical, like running, jumping, throwing, whatever the case may be, you want whatever exercise you're doing, whatever task you're trying to accomplish, to be challenging, right? Like you want it to challenge the system to drive that adaptation forward. That challenging comes with more effort that is required of you to be able to perform that task, and that effort requires more involvement of like different systems within the body, energy system, your CNS, your muscles, whatever the case may be. When you're looking at lifting in general, and you want to get stronger, there's one thing about you wanting to get stronger, and one thing about you want to be stronger at what you're doing. Meaning, you want the exercise to be challenging you to get you stronger, or you want the exercise to put you in a condition to be the strongest. They're two different and competing sides of the spectrum. They don't necessarily have to match. One is training, one is performance. Now, if you want to lift weights and those weights to be as heavy as they humanly can possibly be, then you want no pause between the eccentric and the concentric. You want to probably bounce a little bit at the bottom, use that. I wouldn't
Stretch,
call
shorten
it the
cycle.
stress shortening cycle because
Okay.
the range of motion is too long to be considered plyometrics and the timing of it is off. But nevertheless, a little bit of that potentiation, because that's going to allow you to lift a lot of weight.
Mm-hmm.
If you're in a powerlifting meet or a weightlifting meet, that's how you win. So you want that. But that's not what's getting you stronger. What's getting you stronger is eliminating that benefit, that boost of energy that comes from elastic energy, momentum, and all that good stuff, to put your CNS in a condition to having to put maximum effort in the lift. And you do that if you pause at the bottom of the eccentric. You want to be that initial spike in rate of force development, which is what really drives adaptation, to be due to your brain activating your muscles and not elastic energy in the system making the lift easier for you. So it really depends on what you're looking at. And I think, and actually, I know because I've tested that and I can measure that on force plates, that when I do velocity-based training and I do respect that little pause at the bottom, which is not that big of a deal, it just forces you to lower the weight by 5-10% at best. It's not like you have to go off your water max
Right.
to be able to train. It's just a little bit less. It's a good pause, and for that pause up, you just accelerate as fast as you humanly possibly can. The overall and long-term change in rate of force development are second to none. Like the type of adaptation you get from it, and we have evidence to support it. So it's not just my empirical experience. There's a whole field of studies on early rate of force development showing what's the best way to develop it. So that's why I disagree, because for training purposes, well, if you have to take a pause, so be it. Take a pause and get stronger. But then
Right.
if you actually want to lift a lot of weight, then the pause is no longer beneficial. I agree with that. If you want to, the athletes I'm working with, those sessions that are not VBT sessions,
Mm-hmm.
and we normally start at 85% of water max or even above that, I'm not going to ask them to pause. Not out of
Yeah.
my mind. They're going to do whatever they need to do to lift the weight, because at that point, the type of adaptation we're after is mostly the endocrine system. We want those weights to be heavy to prime a significant increase in testosterone. That's what we want. So we want that magnitude of load to be the biggest possible. But then when we finesse our approach and we look at the neuromuscular component, and now we're looking on rate of force development, we're working on the functioning of the neuromuscular system. Then we pause, we go a little lighter, maybe 70 to 80%, depending on how strong they are. And then we add VBT. And that's where we really prime that neuromuscular component of it. And they all work together. It's hormones, it's neuromuscular system, is your muscles, is your tendons. You have to develop them all. And there's a place for everything. But in general, I wouldn't agree that pausing at the bottom is on anybody
Yeah.
concerning.
I don't. I mean, I do a lot of pause reps and pin presses and all kinds of stuff like that. Like, it's more. I think what I was trying to get at was more like when you look at the research. If you see a study where the entire study was paused, like how do you incorporate that into your programming? You know, if you're not doing pause reps, or like how do you roll in that little bit of information about the actual method of the study and the device used into applications with a different type of device? You know.
You, I get that. You
Yeah.
read the methods and you read what they've done. If they're people with a little bit of common sense, that pause is not going to be longer than a second or so,
Yeah.
because then it becomes challenging. But if they're doing it in a laboratory setting where you absolutely need like a 4 seconds pause at the end of every segment of the movement, that is not very applicable. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like it's a trade-off. You want to
Yeah.
pause enough to make it more challenging, but not too long that you're destroying your chances of lifting weights.
Uh-huh.
There needs to be a epi compromise.
Yeah. So when we're looking at velocity-based training, we kind of talked about this a little bit last time, but I was really curious about how much variability there is within like a single athlete. So like let's say we set a target where we were going to do however many sets we could before we got to that 30% drop in velocity. Have you found that working with like you might have a single athlete where like 1 week to another or 1 month to another where like the amount of volume that they can do before they hit that target is really like, is there like a substantial variation, or does it seem to be pretty tight within an athlete from week to week?
Massive variation. And
Yeah.
a lot of that can be explained by simple fatigue.
Hmm.
A lot of that can be even intentional, depending on how you go about program design. We do quite a bit of overreaching in our programs. So sometimes it's intentional. But just to give you some numbers, some like realistic numbers. So normally when we do velocity based training, we try to stay around 0.5 meter per second,
Hmm.
roughly, which depending on the athlete, may be anywhere between a very high 60% to mid range 70% of water max. Uh, Very often, very rarely, we go above 75, close to 80. Only a few athletes can handle that. So think about that. If you were to take a random load of like 75% of water max, if you were to go to volitional failure, you probably do like 10 reps, 8 to 10 reps per set. When you do velocity-based training, because you have a 20% velocity loss, your number of repetition in reserve is going to be quite high. You're probably going to do maybe like 5 reps per set. You're looking at that range, 4 to 6.
Hmm.
There are days where an athlete can easily perform close to 12 to 14 sets of squats at that load in that velocity range when they're very well rested. The very same athlete under the very same load with the same target velocity and velocity loss can do on a bad day no more than 4 sets. So you're looking at a drastic swing in volume,
Hmm.
and that's how we normally. Well, suffice to say that we usually don't want to go to that extreme. We don't want to see that massive decrease in volume, because that decrease in volume is indicative of an increase in internal load, which means they're not recover well. So whatever you put on paper, it looks decently intense to you, but it's way more intense than you expect it to be. The athlete is perceiving that as a bigger workload, so you need to adjust your program immediately. But for smaller variations, like let's say like a 10 to 20% variation in workload, we use that to track fatigue over time. So we use that as a form of auto-regulation, if you will, where we don't necessarily look at repetition in reserve or RPE, because velocity, if you look at a continuum where you have like your rep max, so your max number of repetitions to failure, then you have your repetition in reserve, which a long time ago used to be called buffer training. Now, because we're fancy, we say repetition in reserve. And somewhere in between, you put your RPE, rating or specific exertion. VBT is just what you need to go from a subjective approach to repetition reserve to an objective approach to repetition reserve, because now you're looking at velocity loss as a mean to establish the number of repetition reserve. So they're all connected. They're looking at the same substrate, and that is neuromuscular fatigue. You want to find a way to measure it. And the way can be subjective based on your RPE or objective based on velocity loss. So you're looking at the same thing. And when you start looking at velocity-based training, the advantage of that is that you can do auto-regulation without sacrificing intensity. So without necessarily detraining the athlete, just adjusting the volume based on your velocity loss, and based on that's what makes a massive difference based on the load that you're using. So allow me to take a small digression. So I apologize. I'm going to take
go wherever you want to go.
And that's a problem that I discuss a lot in class, and I've talked about that with several people that do VBT at a very high level, much better than I do. And that seems to be the common denominator when it comes to problems with evidence-based practice, is that even if you were to come across a paper that deals with velocity-based training, that application of velocity-based training, because of the requirement for standardization in the program design and the study design, always ends up being keeping your target velocity the same and letting the weight adjust accordingly.
Yeah.
Because your dependent variable might be jump height or isometric mid-thigh pull, peak force, or whatever you, but your independent variable, if you're studying velocity-based training, is going to be that velocity. So you want to keep it where it's supposed to be, not to add confusion in your study. And as a consequence, when people come to you, when your participants come to you, you're constantly adjusting the load to match that velocity. And that in and of itself, it's a bias toward auto-regulation. Because if you look at the original studies on VBT, and I'm talking about back in the 80s, the rule that they all follow was that what we call VBT is training at a certain velocity, let's say 0.5 meter per second, in a condition where you're using the heaviest load possible that you can move at that velocity. Meaning, if in normal condition I can do 200 pounds at 0.5 meter per second, that is going to be my training load. When I have to lower that weight, then I'm auto-regulating. I'm not eliciting the same type of adaptation. I'm not challenging the system in the same manner. So a way to do auto-regulation with velocity-based training is doing correct profiling of the athlete. So the same way you have your 1 rep max, you know what your heaviest load that you can handle at 0.5 meter per second. And every time you go to the weight room, you put the same weight on the bar, you look at the velocity. Is the velocity is less than what you expect it to be, now you can objectively quantify fatigue, and now you can do auto-regulation. But you have an objective mean to do it, which is you're standardizing your load and your velocity, which is your external load, your mechanical load, and you're looking at that external load, what effect it has on your internal load, which is fatigue, which is the velocity at which you move that load. If the velocity is going down, that means you're perceiving that load to be heavier than what it is. That means you're very fatigued. If your velocity is going up, well, that's awesome. That means you're getting stronger and more powerful. But you need to keep that load consistent. And that, unfortunately, is something that in research is, I don't want to say it's impossible to do, but very challenging to accomplish. So that's a big gap that practitioners struggle to bridge when it comes to, okay, this is what I've learned in the papers, but like, how do I actually scale it to a program that follows the principle of progressive overload? And if you're not increasing that load over time in a systemic manner, you're negating all the effects of resistant training to begin with. There needs to be progressive overload. Sorry, that was way too long.
No, that's okay.
No, it's great.
And so I feel like like in a traditional, like a percentage-based program, right? You'd have one workout that was at whatever percentage, 80%, right? In a week, right? We're saying we're building our programs in a weekly schedule. So Monday we squat and we get up to 80% or something. We come back on Thursday, most programs wouldn't have you squatting at 80% again, right? So like I would imagine it's probably similar with the velocity based training where like those, those back up to back sessions you'd have decreases in your expectations and then but over time we want the progressive overload. Or are you saying we want to hit that, we want to hit that number every time we're in or more, like where's the
So could I venture a guess here? Like, kind of what I've heard is by staying on the velocity, you don't ever have to do that.
right.
Right? Like I kind of so I follow that to a T.
Right.
Like if you look at it, it's scaffolded through the weeks, but you always see like the main bench day, my backup bench day, my main squat day, right? My cleans and stuff. So if I followed velocity, do I even have to worry about that second set, or are they just fresh? The velocity kept them, like using the VBT. Are they just fresh?
Yeah.
To go
So
that
what is
second
our
time?
programming window? What does that window look like? If we're doing a velocity based program versus doing a, traditional, like I auto regulate everything. So I'm a terrible person really to talk about programming because I do put on more weight every week. Well, I don't train in weeks even. I train in 5-day rounds and I auto regulate everything and all that kind of stuff. So like these are not always, I'm not always an expert on talking about percentage based programs, but I have seen that in virtually every percentage-based program I've ever looked at, right? So, like, how is that similar to what we're going to end up actually doing in velocity-based training? Is it a volume adaptation instead of a load adaptation? Like, is there any difference in terms of what your expectations are in a first and second workout in a week before you get that 4-day break and roll back around again?
I just want to say that we're going to need a third episode to make everything fit, but because we just opened the door for like a much bigger conversation. Um, so I'm going to take a step back and say, if you're defining a traditional approach to percentage based training,
Yeah,
which
which is hard to do, right?
which is very hard to define what traditional is.
Uh-huh.
Sure.
But you're describing like a Monday, Thursday squat
Right.
day, for instance.
Yeah.
Or if you look at some of the maybe a little bit older approaches, would be like a more like a heavy, light, medium type of approach.
Yeah, like a Shaco style programming where you
Yeah,
do
where
a
you
heavy
start
one and a
waving
medium and a light. Yeah.
that load. So if and I'm sorry because when you look at physiology, things get a little bit more. They get more complicated to understand, but much more simple in terms of the practical application. So
Right.
it depends on like, okay, you're periodizing, you're creating a program, and that program will have a degree of progressive overload. How you define that overload depends on your target.
Mhm.
So if your target is, if you're trying to get stronger by building bigger muscles, that overload comes in the form of volume.
Right.
You want more volume to have more hypertrophy. And that is the reason why we talked about that briefly our last episode.
Mhm.
In a frame of reference where strength and hypertrophy are held to the same value, like you need to, if you want to get strong, you need to get bigger first. Then that approach of like heavy, light, medium allows you in a similar span of time, like a week, to fit way more volume. You can train 3 times those muscle groups and get them to grow more. Of course, they're going to be more fatigue with more volume, and that's why you
Right.
have to lower the intensity in the day after your heavy session and then bring it back up towards the end of the week. So it makes perfect sense if you're looking at hypertrophy as a
Right.
mean to an end, which is getting stronger. But if you now shift your focus and say, okay, and that's what I have to do in the line of work that I find myself in now, because body weight matters a lot. And
Right.
even more than body weight, body size matters a lot because of drag and aerodynamic efficiency. So these cyclists have to be very strong and very, very powerful, but also very aerodynamic on their bike. So they can't be too big where there's too much drag slowing them down. So we can't add muscles unless we want to. We need to. So when you now look at neuromuscular performance only, that progressive overload doesn't come in the form of volume anymore, comes in the form of intensity.
Right.
Meaning every time you get back to the weight room, you need to be able to produce more, as simple as that sound, more work, more power, more force, more velocity. You need to have a progression of sort. And you can only do that if you come back to the weight room when you're fresh and ready to go. If you're fatigued, even if you do auto-regulate and you lower the weight, if you look at the overall power production during the session, it's going to come down because you're going to be moving less weight, you're going to get more fatigue, and that velocity is going to come down. So in theory, if you train on Monday and you come back on Thursday to train again, on that Thursday, you're either supposed to do a little bit more weight, a little bit more velocity, or a combination of both.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the difference is that if you're feeling great, you slept like a king, and you ate like very good food, and you're feeling great for that day, and you feel like going up in weight, the fact that you can lift that weight doesn't mean that that weight is training you. Because if you're feeling great and you're going up with weight, but now you're sacrificing velocity, well, again, the power output is going to come down. The overall amount of overload that you're trying to create is not going to be quite there. You think it is because the number of the bar is going up, but you're actually not doing more. You're probably doing less in terms of overall power. But if you have velocity, and velocity tells you that on Monday, you did 200 pounds at 0.5 meter per second. Now it's Thursday, you warm up, you put 200 pounds on the bar, and now the bar is moving at 0.55, 0.56, 0.57. That's showing you that you are not only rested, but you actually carried over some positive adaptation for the first session. So you start to see that trend going up. You start seeing that progress going up. So what do? You add more weight, you stay on target. So now by adding weight, you come back to that 0.5 meter per second that you had on Monday, but you're there with more weight on the bar. So you're producing more power. And now you start creating that trend in progressive overload that is never, ever going to stop. The only time when it's going to stop is where you go through a period where lifting is no longer your priority and you have more training on the field, more cycling, whatever the case may be. And now you have that fatigue building up. And now you don't want to see an improvement in performance anymore. You're just happy if you can maintain. And that's how you switch from developing an athlete, so off season, to maintenance mode, which is the in season. But we said that sentence. I saw that on a reel that you guys captured from last episode, where like if you do VBT, you no longer need periodization. Well, you no longer need periodization because you have a number to go by, and the number is going to reflect the change in fatigue. So when you see that fatigue happening because you're going into the season, you just follow along, adapt, auto-regulate, change the load, and you're maintaining your athlete where he's supposed to be. So all the guesswork is gone. Like you don't need to think about what's the best way to progress. There's only one way to progress, and that's what you're going to follow. Assuming though that your goal is purely neuromuscular, so you're trying to get stronger by means of developing a more efficient neuromuscular system. If your goal is hypertrophy, which for many power lifter is, and it's important, or like throwers or weightlifters or whatever the case may be, well, then you need to find a middle ground where you can feed that volume in the equation at some point.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
I got a question there.
Did I answer the question?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, every time you answer a question, just 19 questions pop up in my head, but and then I forget 18 of them. So if let's say somebody does come in and it is squat day and they can't, let's say they did 200 at 0.5 and they put 200 on the bar and it's not moving at the proper velocity, do you lower, right? Because we talked about every time we're going up. But I imagine at some point in time, someone doesn't go up. Do you just wait for them to be like, maybe it's not squat day? Or do you take them off squat and move them to their accessories? Like what happens when an athlete comes in and it is supposed to be squat day, but they can't do the weight or the velocity?
If you add 19 questions, and that's the only one that is left, it's an excellent question. That's the best question you can possibly ask on this one. Because that ties in the notion of, well, athlete monitoring at a bigger perspective, but it's readiness, neuromuscular fatigue. So, and there are protocols that you can follow. I didn't come up with them. You can, we talk about the example you just gave of like, you put a weight on the bar and you try to complete that task, but you can't get the same velocity. That shows that under the same condition, you're no longer capable of producing the same amount of power. And that is, by a textbook, the definition of neuromuscular fatigue. You can produce the same amount of power that you were capable of producing when you were rested. And the way we monitor that, it's one of many variables that we monitor when we look at athlete readiness, as neuromuscular fatigue. We can monitor that through different tests and different metrics. The most common one, by far the most common one, would be jump height, when you do a counter movement jump at the beginning of the session. But they're looking at the same effect. Your body weight is the same. Now you can jump as high, meaning you can produce as much takeoff velocity, therefore your fatigue. The principle is the same. You're looking at the same physical quantity just through different metrics. And jump height is great because it's not invasive. You can
Right.
do that before the workout even starts, like after the warm up. So you immediately know whether or not the athlete is in good shape. You don't even need to get to the squat to figure that out. But if you don't do that, and then you get to the squat, then the example you just gave, it's a form of monitoring for readiness and fatigue. You warm up, you build up to it, you put the weight on the bar, you see what happens. Now, different things can happen. The one that you just described is like, let's say my target load was 200 and my target velocity was 0.5. I need to keep one of them consistent, and that's always going to be the load because the velocity is going to reflect my internal effort, so my level of fatigue. So you keep the load and you see what velocity you get out of it. If the velocity is lower than you're supposed to do, it's like your jump height at the beginning of the session is not as good as it should be. The rule of thumb, and again, I didn't come up with this, these are protocols you can find in the literature. The rule of thumb is like the first time that happens, you auto regulate, so you lower the weight. You don't cancel the session, you assume it may be a one off, so you lower the weight, you just complete the session as planned, and you move
Okay.
on with that. The problem is when they come back the third time now and they ever recover and they're still not capable of getting back to the same weight and the same velocity, now is the second consecutive measurements of readiness that is not up to where it's supposed to be. That becomes your first red flag. And then you say, okay, now there's something with the program that is not working well, and there's something creating a little bit too much fatigue that I'm not accounting for, and the athletes are not recovering the way they should. So at that point, you pull them out of the session. You don't squat for the session. You do some active recovery modality that can be like Dr. Brian Mann loves to do, more like bodybuilding type stuff, where like you lower the weight. It's a little bit more like burning type of exercise, if you will, but less taxing for your CNS and for your hormones. You still wrap the session up and then you send them home and hope for the best when they come back next time. We normally, when that happens, we normally send them to do more a conditioning session. So for that would be like a zone 3, zone 2 type of session on the bike. There's no right or wrong way to do it, as long as it works. As long as the next time they come back, they feel somewhere better. The biggest problem is when you have 3 consecutive points in a row where you're not capable of performing as well as you should. And that is almost certainly an indicator of overreaching, potentially early stage of overtraining. So that becomes a massive red flag where like risk of injury goes up. The chronic effect of that fatigue is going to stay around for way longer, like weeks at length. So that's a point where you never want to get. Like you never want to have 3 consecutive workouts where you're not capable of eating that velocity. But your continuum will always be first red flag, soft red flag, you auto-regulate and you train. Second consecutive one, you pull back and you deload. Third, you take a whole step back, you reassess everything, you maybe give them a week off, and then you start building off that volume again. And it helps a lot to, like, when it comes to like mitigating the risk of injury, but also keeps you consistent with that training adaptation. So my piece of advice for people that may be following this podcast is, and I'm a meathead myself, so if I could start every workout with a barbell, I would, because I love nothing more than squatting. My favorite exercise of all times in the weight room, and the only one I'm good at or decent at. Horrible weightlifting skills, but at least I can squat. I would love to start every workout with a squat, and that will give me a chance to auto-regulate immediately if I need to. But the reality of it is that when you work with athletes that are not power lifters or they're not weightlifters, there's going to be so much stuff that happens before they get to a barbell, like your plyo, your core training, maybe your Olympic lifts where you can't really do VBT, your depth jump. So much opportunity for undertraining them, overtraining them, or potentially hurting them, that you don't want to rely on that squat halfway through the session to monitor the effects of fatigue. So my recommendation is always implement a basic jump test at the end of the warm-up. You can do that with a smartphone. You don't need force plates. You don't need a jump mat. Like jump height is a pretty robust metric that you can get with very cheap devices, but be methodical with that and incorporate it in your training program. And when the jump height is dropping way too much for what you want it to be, then start assuming that session is going to be a challenge and things are not going to go as planned. So budget in some maybe decrease in volume, decrease in intensity, and whatnot, so that at least you preserve that adaptation and decrease somewhat the risk of injury.
Yeah. I think that there was like one thing in there that you mentioned that I think is just a drop of gold that everybody should hear, whether they're doing velocity based training or not, is that when you get into the phase where you're overreaching, where you've passed the point where you needed a deload and you keep going, that it is going to take longer to burn that fatigue. And it's something that it's a trap that I always fall in because I love training really hard. Like I feel like if you go in the weight room and you don't do something that makes your life flash before your eyes, then it wasn't a good workout.
Agree.
And so I have ended up in that spot a lot of times, and I've also torn a pec a few times and torn a bicep tendon and torn my abs, and I've done just about everything because I just really love going hard in the weight room. But it really does, when you get to the point where you're like, I can't do my workouts like I'm supposed to, and you just keep going, you're getting into the point where your fatigue isn't going to take a 1 week deload. It might take 2 or 3, or like it might be a while till you feel like you're okay again, even if you have light training or some other intervention in between.
Yeah, and if you're not an athlete, a professional athlete, an athlete playing a sport, like every one of those workouts that you're now deloading is just an opportunity that you're never coming back.
Right.
Right. Like people our age, like don't miss. You should never miss a workout.
Right.
1 turns to 2, turns to 6, turns to it's 9 months and you're restarting.
Yeah. It turns out you really like watching cartoons with your kids and you don't go back to the gym.
Yeah, so like it very quickly happens. I always joke with my kids, and they always say, like, anytime I always talk crap to my athletes, and they'll always be like, well, you're a grown man, of course you're stronger, or you know what I mean. It's like, you think that being 37 is some sort of like you are confused about how bad a 37-year-old's body is. Like the fact that, like,
if I just wasn't doing anything.
Yeah, the fact that you think an 18-year-old should be losing to a 37-year-old is just not true. Like I hardly get out of bed in the morning.
Yeah.
But so avoiding that fatigue, the mindset of being able to take the deload, like still, like you said, like I know that it's great. It's still in my brain. Sometimes I'm like,
I could push through this one.
We could probably push through this.
We could skip this deload.
But it's such a stupid meathead ideology. Like, it's very short-sighted is what it is.
I agree. And I think this is going to come across as probably mean, and I don't want that to be the case, but having been around athletes for a very long time and being addicted to lifting myself, and I know how difficult it is to take a deload week, that taking a pound away from the bar hurts your ego, like let alone taking a day off or something like that. So I get that. I respect that very much. But I feel like when you're having that conversation with your athletes, because there should be a conversation around it. It shouldn't be like you read a number and okay, you deload this week. You should explain them what's going on and what type of process you're implementing, because that builds value for it. When you're having that conversation, you have an opportunity to see the athlete you're working with, because when you tell someone take a deload week and next thing you know they're out of the door, natural selection will probably eliminate those athletes from your weight room pretty soon, because they're not very driven. They're not very motivated to be there. When you tell an athlete, like, dude, like, or sorry, like, you can't go heavy today. It's not safe for you to go to heavy today. And he or she asks, okay, tell me what I can do instead, or how I can go about like getting better. Well, now you know you can invest a lot in that athlete because they're there for the right reason. They want to get better. So I really think these are important conversations to be had with your athletes, because first of all, builds culture and appreciation for our job, gets a massive amount of buy-in, because when you pull them back and they follow your lead and they come back the next time and they actually feel stronger and outperform themselves, it's a buy-in you'll never lose. Like at that point, they don't trust you, they trust the process. They know it works. And you're just the middleman making sure that is taken care of. So it's massive. So it's good to build value and have a conversation about these things with the athletes as well.
Yeah, and there is something to be said for, the training models where you are doing, the functional overreaching, right? Like that is a part of the game. And so if you really you want to make sure that your athletes understand what's going on, so that as you start like extending that or pushing that and it's intentional, they're in for the process. They know what they're doing. They understand how it works. Like, I remember like the whole first 10 years that I lifted weights, it was basically a peak. If it was more than 5 reps, it was cardio, and I wasn't going to live that life. And then I restructured and did like some real true like block periodization. And I remember when I started, I had a 6 week peak or 12 week peak or whatever to do. And I remember the gap between when I started and when I finished didn't make any sense really. Like I don't even want to give numbers, because if I said numbers out loud, people would think I was lying. But like the amount of improvement that was there was phenomenal. And so it was my first time doing that, so like and I had to convince myself that I was going to do it, that I was going to follow my own advice instead of just doing the things I enjoyed doing. But like it was hugely valuable. And so when you can get your athletes to buy into the process and do it the right way, it's worth a lot in the end. And you really only got to get them through it the first time. Once they
Yeah.
understand, then it's smooth. Yeah. Okay, so the other thing that you mentioned that I really wanted to go back on, because it was on my list, now it's on my list twice, of things to talk about for things to think about with velocity-based training. I was really curious about the effect of when we're training for sport, right? We're not just in the weight room unless you're a power lifter or a weightlifter, and even then you might be doing some plyos and some other stuff like to do some other general conditioning. But if you're a cyclist or a shot putter or a basketball player or whatever, and you're doing some work before you make it to the weight room, you have two considerations there. I mean, well, two that jump out to me right away. One is the fatigue that your previous stuff is going to generate, and the second is the potentiation that your previous work is going to generate. So I know, like, I'm getting older, and I can still move really fast if I ask my body to do it. But I've noticed that, like, if I do a little bit of plyometric stuff before I squat, my squat workouts are 10% more weight and they're twice as fast. If I don't do the plyometric stuff, they're slow and less powerful. And so that little bit of potentiation before I do my squat work seems to help a ton. More so now that I'm 40 than when I was 19. But how do you adjust that dial dealing with the the potentiation and the fatigue, and how does that interact with the model that you develop of the athlete? Because you evaluate them, maybe just in the weight room or whatever, and then they come to you after basketball practice for the rest of their career. Like, how do you put those pieces together?
It's a, it's a very good question, and the answer is not as simple as it may be. It may sound. Because the practical application is pretty straightforward. Like if they come to you that they're fatigued, well, they're fatigued, you have to cope with it. So you have
Mm-hmm.
to do something to fix that. And that something is lower the weights or
Right.
lower the volume or manage that fatigue. It's just a matter of like how you eventually work around it and try to get the best out of that session, in the sense that, so if we're looking at just, let's call it priming the athletes for the activity they're about to do,
Yeah.
which I just want to be careful using the word potentiation, because if we look at that in the literature, that's a
Yeah.
very specific thing.
Yeah, we've had that conversation with almost every guest, is that the vocabulary doesn't really match. We don't have perfect words for what we want to do. So on the podcast, we use them pretty loosely. So when we say potentiation, we're saying you're doing some activity that's meant to have an effect on how you do the next activity.
Correct.
Yeah.
And that effect is going to bring you to, so the way we, at least maybe I'm completely wrong, but the way we define potentiation in a scientific terminology, if you will, or PAP, post-activation potentiation, is whatever I'm doing to prepare me for that activity. Let's say a jump,
Mm-hmm.
that priming activity, like an heavy squat, has an effect on the jump that comes next, that is going to bring me to jump higher than I would normally do without that potentiation effect. So
Right.
it's giving me a bonus compared to my normal state of performance,
Right.
and that which gives you tremendous
Mm-hmm.
tremendous gains when it comes to adaptation, because now you're outperforming yourself constantly. A different thing is if I come in fatigue and I'm already struggling to get through the workout, and I'm going to do something that is going to potentiate me in the sense that is going to bring me to do a little bit better than be completely shitty, forget my language.
Yeah.
But it's still not even comparable to the benefit of a true potentiation. And I hope that gives you the prospect. Like,
Right.
if I normally jump 40 centimeters and I do a heavy squat before I jump 40 centimeters, I take adequate rest, I'm going to be able to jump 42. That's
Right.
a true potentiation. But if I normally jump 40 and now I'm destroyed because I'm coming from basketball practice and I can only jump 36 and I do some plyo, the plyo is probably going to add me to get back up to like 38, 39, but it's not potentiating anything. It's just getting me to perform a little bit better.
Right.
So in that sense, I feel like velocity-based training is more on the end result than that potentiation. In its purest application, where you're looking at the heaviest load possible at about 0.5 meter per second, meaning that you probably need something to prepare you for that. And that something is usually some type of isometric work or something that requires more of a force output or force effort than just velocity. However, you can flip it around and do, for instance, and we do that a lot when we have to accommodate for sessions that are done after practice, when you lower your load by a lot, your target velocity becomes quite higher. So in a squat, you're looking at about 1 meter per second, which for the majority of athletes tend to be somewhere around your peak power output, so something very explosive. And you do a little something like 3 sets of 3 or 4 repetitions. So the volume is very little. Your rest periods are long between sets, but you get the athlete to say, okay, now we put 50% on the bar. You're coming in fatigued, so you're probably not going to be able to move quite at 1 meter per second yet. Just try to do very little sets of very little reps, but try to get to that 0.1 meter per second, 1.0 meter per second. Try to move the bar faster. Try to move the bar faster. They might not get there, but it's enough to activate and wake them up in a sense for the session that comes. Because now you're getting him a target that is velocity oriented, so it's going to be more explosive. It's going to activate your CNS quite a bit. It's not going to fatigue you that much if you keep the volume little, and it's going to prepare you for the session that comes next. So what we normally do, we bring them to the weight room, and then we let them go through their warm up very slowly, very gently, because they're already fatigued. And then once they get to like somewhere around like 40-50% of water max on the bar, we just ask them to be deliberate and be as fast as they can possibly can. Try to hit that 1 meter per second mark, or at least get as close as possible. And then we move into like all explosive stuff and strength stuff and what have you. But I wouldn't call that a potentiation per se, but it's more of a priming for the session to come.
Yeah. So do you find would it be wise then, like, so let's say that you're wanting to include velocity based training, you've done your research, you've done all your stuff, you work with a team of throwers, so like we'll say you're a collegiate, you're in the college program, you got shot putters, hammer throwers, discus throwers. Would it be wise to, when you go to create your profile for your athletes, when you go to do that initial testing, would it be wise to do that kind of in the same flow as they would normally do their training? So like I was a hammer thrower, shot putter, right? And so it was like you do your technical stuff and then you do your speed power stuff and then you do your heavy stuff, right? So is it going to be wise then to do your profiling, in that power and heavy portion of it when they've already experienced those other things that might be potentiating or priming activities?
Under normal circumstances, I would say no, but in this particular case, absolutely yes.
Yeah.
If you know that that's your structure,
Right.
that's what you have to deal on a daily basis, well, there's no point in doing otherwise, because the performance that you're going to see in the weight room when they're rested is never going to be even remotely comparable to what they're capable of doing after half hour throwing or
Right.
more.
Right.
And I've been a thrower myself. I've done a lot of work with throwers, so I relate to that a lot. And even the technical sessions are still quite challenging under the physical point of view. So you, by the time you get to squatting, you'll be spinning around for like half hour. You're not going to be that great at squatting. So you need to account for that amount of fatigue. And I think if you're bound to that structure, like you can't change it, and that's where you
Yeah.
need to feel your lifting. Then at that point you rather test and profile the athlete in a similar condition to where they normally train and compete.
Yeah, and then maybe looking at it from a periodization point of view, like you have that profile that you're doing when you've got them and it's, preseason or in season, but maybe out of season you can reprofile them and be like, hey, we're going to focus on, like you're super explosive and you got a big frame, but you weigh 200 pounds and you're competing against a bunch of guys who are 340, right? So like we're going to take a little time and get you bigger. So we create a new profile and build off that for the off season kind of thing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I don't want to diverge too much from this topic, but you mentioned block periodization. A wonderful thing about VBT is, I think we mentioned that last time. You can see that intensification and realization phase happening in front of your eyes, because if you can get the athlete to squat close to 0.8 meter per second ish in a squat. Talk about a squat in this particular case, like a 0.8 meter per second with a decent amount of load. When there's somewhere fatigue at the end of an accumulation block, and you really program your intensification, your transformation phases that follow well, that load would be the load that they move at 1 meter per second in 2-3 weeks time, which
Yeah.
means that now you've seen that power coming back in with a bonus on top of it, because now you're moving more weight that you could do months ago at 1 meter per second, 1.0 meter per second. So it's a great tool to monitor your training and making sure that whenever you are supposed to be deloading in a sense, or decreasing volume or decreasing fatigue, you're actually doing it. The numbers are showing you that you're doing it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, oh, good.
Go ahead if it's off that.
No. Sorry.
Okay. It's just kind of just always funny. You're always like deep diving, and then like my questions are like on the surface here. But I always am trying to think like, how would I do this in the weight room, right? Lots of kids trying to think of like what are the pitfalls? Could it work? What does that first phase? Let's say it's the beginning of the off season, and we need to see. I'm thinking like for my group, it would be primarily football. We're done with the season. We do our little recovery block there at the end of our first trimester. It's the beginning of our second trimester. We're ready to start lifting. It's easy for me because I could just, at the end of first try, I max them out. We find out what the 1 rep max is. Percentages are laid out. We just start. What does that first stage look like? Like, what is a velocity-based max out session look like? Do we just keep going up until we cannot hit the 0.5? Like, would you
the actual test for the profile?
Yeah, the profile. Yeah.
Do I just keep going up weight like a normal max out session, but instead of it's a 1 rep max, it's just what is my 0.5? Like, what's my max weight that I could move 0.5?
That could be an option, but if you want to look at it in terms of like turning into an actual test/assessment, so a session that is very easy to repeat with consistent results, but also that gives you enough information that you can manipulate your training in more than one way, so you have more information coming in from that testing session. The best way to do would be a proper testing session. So the athlete should come in somewhere fresh. So maybe like give them a 3 days deload before that, or maybe like a little longer if needed. And then they do a good warm up. They take their time, and then you need to test every lift that you're going to be using in your program, unfortunately, because the load velocity relationship is different depending on the lift, and is different depending on the athlete. So if, let's say, if I can squat a 0.5 meter per second, a 70% of my 1 rep max, and then I go bench and I put 70% on the bench, I can't guarantee it's going to be 0.5 meter per second. Every lift is going to be a little bit different. So you need to test the movement that you're going to be using for that program. That's why a lot of practitioners end up using just one main lift for VBT, because it's more time efficient. So let's say the squat. So now you warmed up. The way I normally do it, there are a few protocols that you can find in the literature, but they're all somewhere similar. You do a set of 3 reps at 30% of your 1 rep max, then you give them 3 minutes rest. A set of 3 reps at 45, then 3 minutes rest. A set of 3 reps at 60, then 3 minutes rest. And then a set of 3 at 75. And you measure the velocity for each repetition. You average them across the set. Now you have a number, and that number corresponds to the load. So you have like 30%, it was 1.1 meter per second. 45 was 0.9 meter per second. 60 was 0.7 meter per second. 75 was 0.5 meter per second. And now you have a range of velocities that you can use for your program. And you pick and choose whichever one you want to use for your next phase, and you match that with the corresponding load. So let's say that you're planning on doing a mesocycle or a block of 0.5 meter per second, then the easiest solution, you pick whichever load you tested that brings you closer to that 0.5 meter per second. And there are corrections that you can do if you want to be more accurate with that, but that would be a great starting point, because that shows you that under optimal condition, that's the load that you can move at that velocity. So if that load is going to fluctuate from session to session, it's going to be indicative of a state of fatigue. Also, if the load is not going to fluctuate, but your velocity is going up, that's going to be a positive sign of adaptation. So that gives you that consistency across the board that you can use as a way to test and then assess the athletes with every training session. That's the beauty of it. You could just build up exponentially until you get to the load that you want, the velocity that you want. Just every time you're going to do it, it's going to be somewhere different. And that test, retest is kind of going to affect your long-term interpretation of that data. So to keep it consistent, just do the same protocol every time in the same identical manner, and let that guide your decisions, and also inform you on the progress that you're making with the athlete.
So I got one more question. I'm hoping the answer is yes and not no here, but is that protocol or a similar protocol in your book? So if there was somebody like me that wants to do that, they could purchase your book and learn all those things.
Yes.
Yeah, it would be really bad if you like, is it in the book? And you're like, oh shit, I forgot.
No, it is.
Put that one in there.
And even everything we talked about, the readiness and the monitoring, everything is in there, because I mean, velocity-based training is one of many aspects of this biggest thing known as neuromuscular fatigue. And for those who are maybe interested in, like, please, you have to read Enoka. This paper published in 1995 is the gold standard when it comes to understanding fatigue. Like, you don't really understand fatigue unless you read that paper. And then a lot of things about velocity-based training start to make sense.
Yeah. So we only got you for about another 10 minutes. So I got one more thing that I had from the start of the show. And okay, now of course I'm prefacing my question and I'm forgetting. Okay. Oh yeah. Okay. All right. I remember. I'm here. We can do this. All right. When you are, you see decrements in performance or anything, from one session to the next session, I believe, I'm sure that fatigue is the biggest driver for that. Has there been any surprising things that can be big drivers where, like, they have a session that's really down and then they tell you, like, well, I normally, salt my dinner and I didn't put any salt on my dinner? Or, like, has there been any things that were a surprise to you that were like, I didn't think this would have this big of an effect on their ability to perform, that it maybe isn't the kind of systemic fatigue or specific fatigue? Like, has there been any big surprises in your time working with it?
That's a good question. So if I have to be honest, in terms of surprise, I wouldn't say what a surprise, because when we look at fatigue, it's always going to be multifactorial. There's
yeah.
Like, you have one metric that is showing you an aspect of fatigue, but it's the cumulative effect of everything that leads you there to that decrement in performance. But I think personally, the one that I got surprised more was dehydration.
Yeah.
In the sense, don't get me wrong, because of course dehydration is going to have an impact on fatigue.
Right.
But, like, not acute dehydration, meaning like I sweat 3 liters of fluids and I'm going to come and lift. Of course, you would expect to see a decrement.
Right.
But then when the athletes are very diligent and they track their macros, they track their sleep, maybe they're wearing wearable devices or whatever so they know everything that happened in the last 48 hours. They know how much they slept, what was required of their sleep, the HRV, they know everything, and they have a food journal where they report macros and calories and whatever there were days where, like, we're looking at the number and say, dude, like, your jump testing was decent when you came in the weight room, so you're not too fatigued. Everything looks perfect, but you're struggling big time with volume. Like, what is the difference? What happened in the last few hours? And of course, you're controlling for possible variables, like they know what their training was or whatever we found out quite often that the days prior to, they were not going about their normal routine. They were away from home longer than they should. They brought food with them, but they didn't bring adequate amount of water. So they were not as dehydrated as you would consider to be dehydrated, but they didn't drink enough water leading up to that session. And that had a massive impact on their ability to tolerate volume. That was a surprise for me, because I know the effect of dehydration. I'm not stupid. Like, I know that you should be drinking water and stay hydrated. But even the minor changes in your water intake over a period of time can have a substantial effect on a one bout performance in the weight room. So that to me was like, okay, this is cool. Like, I can see where it's coming from, but I wasn't expecting to be that big of a deal.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at a lot of sports, like, there are a lot of weight sports that cut water right at the end, right?
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
If you're saying that even a tiny fluctuation is going to make a big difference for a workout, but that workout could be meet day, that could be wrestling
sport day,
right? Like,
yeah.
that was kind of one of the things we talked about early was how impactful dehydration, even in the sports, let's say like a UFC where it's a 24-hour weigh-in.
Yeah.
It's like a lot of times that rehydration it doesn't
Not
happen
complete.
that fast.
Yeah, I know that's been something like since I was young, I never bought that like you could be some amount of dehydrated and perform at your best. Like the people who were big on, doing the water cuts or whatever, I was just like, you guys are crazy. I don't buy it.
Yeah. And we understand the importance of stay hydrated. I'm not negating that importance. It's absolutely fundamental for you to stay hydrated. But sometimes you don't appreciate the fact that, well, I normally drink, I don't know, 3 liters of water. I drank 2.5 liters of water. It's not going to have that massive an impact. It does have an impact nevertheless.
Yeah.
Like you need to be normally hydrated to perform at your best. And any deviation, you're going to pay the consequence from it. And that to me was like a little bit of a surprise. One thing that I've learned with velocity-based training that wasn't a surprise, but it was very cool to measure, is that sometimes you're reading papers that, or even just blogs or books or whatever that in the weight room, women can tolerate more volume than men, or they are less likely to get fatigued when it comes to like heavy lifting. And men, VBT shows that on the dot almost every time. When you start comparing across the board and say, okay, now we're all training at 0.5, we're all training somewhere on the same repetition range and load. Under normal conditions, like when they're not too fatigued, women can get easily 30% more volume than men and tolerate it very, very well, which is awesome to see.
Yeah. I've often wondered if that, like, I haven't spent enough time reading in that. Like, I've seen those studies, I've seen the headlines, but haven't taken the deep dive into them. Do you know if those are often controlled for, and we're going to run out of time, so this is going to be probably the last question I'm going to ask you. I want to be sure we get you out on time, but do you know if those are controlled for like the absolute load? Because generally, right, our female athletes are smaller than our male athletes, and generally their absolute loads are going to be smaller than our male athletes. If you look at, the super elite 120-pound power lifters, they're pretty comparable in tonnage, but like as you get bigger, the men just get bigger. And so I've often wondered if that was, if we have, I mean, it's not that it really matters practically. It was just a curiosity that I have for, what the driving factors are for that. If a component of that might be the absolute load, that is maybe generating a little less fatigue,
It could be. I'm not aware of any study that particularly looked at that. But usually when you look at just raw numbers in a weight room, and you're trying to compare men and women when it comes to absolute load, you should always think about like what the absolute load is going to show a difference. The relative load is going to show less of a difference. And then if you go into relative load as the load compared to lean body mass and not just body weight, is going to show even less of a difference.
Right.
So it's always good to keep that in mind, because what you're lifting doesn't really tell you the whole picture. Like you need to understand what that compares to your body mass and your body size in terms of effort. And that's something that people need to be pretty familiar doing when you're working with men and women at the same time.
Yeah. And a really common pitfall for like when you're program designing, right? Like if you are looking at somebody else's programming and thinking like, oh, that's good for me, if a lot of those things, if your training experience and, relative load and absolute load and all those kind of things don't line up, then you might need to make some adjustments. Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, I mean, we're getting you right up to time to go to class. We really appreciate you being here again. It's great chatting with you. We're going to have you on as a semi-regular, because now I got like 500 other questions to ask. So we'll probably reach out again in a few weeks or a few months or something.
Write them all down, and we can make it a thing on Wednesday. We can catch up.
Okay. All right.
Thank you very much.
I'm going to hit stop here real quick. Like, comment, subscribe, share. We really appreciate it. Thank you guys for watching. And stay tuned for more.
Thank you.